By the way, some of the guys might also be interested. Have y'all talked at all on the show about the study Todd Driscoll's doing over on Toledo Bend?
Let's get into that. That was on my list. That's really interesting stuff.
So Todd Driscoll's Texas Park and Wildlife district biologist, oversees a bunch of East Texas lakes, including Rayburn and Toledo. And he got funding this year. He got funding actually last year to put originally 50, I think, 30 or 50 radio transmitters in tournament-sized fish, 3-pound fish and above. They caught them all out of an area called Hawgz Basin, which is about 5 miles across and about 10 miles deep. Because Toledo's huge. Toledo's 130,000 acres. And they put transmitters in those fish, and they're going to track them for 2 full years. And so we've done a video series that's in my playlist with Todd talking about what they've discovered so far. So they originally put all the transmitters, they put transmitters in fish last fall as the water was cooling off, and had 100% mortality. Every fish that they did that to died. They're doing the same study on Lake Fork, and they had the same experience. Every fish died. And they had always thought, as we always thought, that fish are most stressed post-spawn when the water's warming up. So they didn't want to put the transmitters in the fish then, not knowing that the fish were apparently equally as stressed when the water's cooling down in the fall. So they waited, they went back over there in May. They've caught a bunch of fish. I think they're currently tracking 16 fish. And basically what they're doing is they catch a fish, they release it, they go over there once a week, they track the fish, they pull up, they find the fish, and then they idle over the top of the fish twice to see if the fish spooks. If the fish doesn't spook, and first they stop to make sure the fish is not in motion. Then they idle over the fish twice to see if the fish spooks. If the fish doesn't spook, they make 5 or 6 casts. I think it's 5 casts at it with a 1/2 ounce weighted worm. If the fish doesn't spook off, then they go right on top of the fish and they drop a drop shot on it 5 times. And so Todd's really, really good, by the way, with Garmin LiveScope.
What color worm?
I don't know the answer to that.
Plum? I'm guessing plum.
Probably something pretty basic, yeah. So they've caught 2 of those fish. And it's in the video. I'm terrible remembering statistics, especially since I make up 85% of them. But in the video, he gives them to me. And I think they had made like 80 presentations to those fish for 2 bites, knowing the fish is right there.
Wow.
They're looking at that fish and they can't make that fish bite.
Wow.
It's been really fascinating. A guy caught an 8-pounder over there on a frog out of what we call gator grass. And that fish lived in less than 3 feet of water all the way until June, when the water was in the mid 80s. And the only reason Todd thinks the fish left is because the water dropped a foot and it pulled out.
So and that was a true shallow water bass.
True shallow water bass. And it's just some of the stuff they're seeing. That 8-pounder now lives on a very nondescript mud flat. And all it does is go up and down that flat and sets up on isolated pieces of wood. He said its favorite thing are either big laydowns or spider stumps, which is spot on. I caught a 1031 on Rayburn this summer. I saw it on a 360 imaging on a spider stump on a root ball of a laydown in 15 feet of water on a flat. I was just up there goofing around, saw the laydown, and I was like, wow, look at that laydown. And I'm like, oh, there's a fish. Flipped over there and it went 1031.
Nice.
On camera.
On camera.
On
nice.
camera.
Yeah.
So if you haven't seen that, and we're gonna do some more. So far we've been able to track the fish just through the summer and into the fall. So now it's going to be really interesting to see what these fish do when it gets ready to start spawning and where they start setting up. So I'm real excited. I think we're going to learn more from this study than we've ever learned in the history of bass fishing because we only catch 0.1% of the fish in any given acre. And he can now see what those fish are doing when we're not catching them.
Yeah. So backing up to where you talked about the first time they put those trackers in the fish in the fall, right? And they had a 100% mortality rate. And so in the spring, it makes sense. They're coming out of the post spawn. So they've been using up all their energy, to do the spawning thing. So I could see them being stressed and the water's getting warmer, but going into the fall, I
Feeding
mean,
up.
you nailed it. You said we all assume that would be a good period because the water's cooling. So is it just got to do with the temperatures transitioning and they're not acclimated to it, or what?
I asked Todd, I said, is there a white paper in this? And he goes, when we understand it, yes. It has flummoxed all the fisheries biologists. There's never been any documentation of something happened like this before, but all the fish at Toledo died, all the fish at Fork died. So then they replicated it in a fish tank where they knew the conditions were perfect. All those fish died.
Wow.
So they know the only constant in all of that was cooling water.
That's very, very interesting.
They developed, and I think it was a bacteria around the wound site, and that's what got all of them. By the way, they found almost all of the transmitters. They found one of the transmitters in an eagle's nest.
So tell us that story. How'd that happen?
The eagle picked up the carcass. They found them scattered up in the woods. So those fish would float to the shore. Raccoon would get them, a fox would get them, coyote would get them, take them up in the woods. And they found their transmitters in the water, in the woods, and they didn't get the one out of the eagle's nest. So what Todd said they did, so it's a directional antenna. And he said they're walking through the woods, and he goes, and they walk right by it, and it gets weak again. So turn around, it goes back. He's like, where is it? It's got to be right here. And Todd said he's standing there while the other guy's doing it, and he looks up, and he goes, pointed at that eagle's nest. And he goes,
oh man, he's like, now you go up there and get it.
You go get that. Let's go up there and make a bald eagle mad.
Yeah.
No,
I'll get you some of that.
But yeah, that eagle picked up that fish, flown up there and eaten it, and left the transmitter in the nest.
Dang. How much do those transmitters cost?
I didn't ask that. They can't be cheap.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. That's an expensive fish.
I know they went to find those transmitters. They wanted all those transmitters back. Matter of fact, all those fish have an external tag on them. And basically it says, if you catch this fish, call this number. And they basically beg people to turn those fish loose. Now, unfortunately at Toledo, there's still a pretty much big catch and eat culture. And so they've asked those guys, if you do that and you harvest that fish, we'll come get the transmitter if you'll tell us where it is.
So have they did any studies on how those fish respond to transducer pings?
So yes and no. Basically, they're running over it with the big motor, and then when they approach it, the electronics are on. Gosh, I wish I could remember the number. I believe the number is 30% of the fish spook when approached on the big motor. So This was a big topic in some of my videos this summer, and I'll tell you another story why. But
so this is when you say big motor, you're talking about on an idle?
Yes, idling over the fish. They idle over them in a figure eight twice.
Okay.
And so there's a young YouTube guy out of Arkansas who talks about you can idle over all your brush piles before you fish them, and I'm like, no, you can't. Those fish will leave. And he says, I catch a lot of fish. Well, yeah, you catch a lot of 2 and 3 pound fish because they're the dummies, right? They're the little fish in the group. And he and I didn't get into it. I'm just commenting in my own videos. And as Todd and I talked about it, I said, and by the way, so Todd's an extremely accomplished tournament angler as well. He's won some ABAs. He's won a lot of stuff, as well as being a field biologist. And I said, will you idle over your fish? And he said, no way. This is before he did the study. So after we turned the cameras off, I said, what do you think about idling over your fish now? And he goes, well, if 30% of them leave that I know about, he goes, why would I even take that chance? 1 out of every 3 fish is going to swim away, and I can't catch them afterwards, which tells me I probably put them on alert that I've only had 2 bites out of all the drop attempts on them. He said, I'm not letting those fish know that I'm there. So the other story there's a guy named John Hope who's still around. He doesn't fish much anymore, but he was the first guy in Texas that was allowed to put transmitters in fish. And Dennis Canada caught a 16-2 out of Lake Fork, and they named the fish Missy. And they tracked Missy for 2 or 3 years. They were the only people to ever catch Missy, and they caught her only to replace the battery in her transmitter. And I got to go out and track Missy with them one day. And if you've ever been on Lake Fork, Wolf Creek's a big creek on Lake Fork. Missy lived in a giant cypress tree where The main boat lane that came into Birch or into Wolf dead ended into another boat lane. And right there, 10 feet off that boat lane's where that fish lived on a point. And so I got in the boat with John and I said, back then we had a camp at Fork and I was obsessed with catching a 10-pounder. And he said, well, I'll show you today why you're not going to catch a 10-pounder. He said, you're a tournament fisherman, aren't you? I said, yes, sir. I was young. And he said, okay. So we go in there and we shut down about 150 yards upwind from where this 16-pound fish is suspended in this tree in 12 feet of water. And we just start letting the wind blow us by. And he's letting me, he's got the headphones, I'm listening, he's listening, same thing, directional antenna. And he goes, okay, she's in that tree. He said, watch this. And we float right by her. I mean, we float maybe 15 feet by that tree and we float 150 yards out there. He cranks the big motor. He makes a big semicircle. We get in the exact same spot again. And he said, all right, before we do this, he said, that fish's brain is the size of a pea. He said, but what we have discovered is a black bass until it's about 6 or 7 years old is like a white-tailed deer. If a white-tailed deer sees something in the woods that's not supposed to be there, they're real curious. So my family cuts timber and we would come into the set after cutting timber and it would be full of deer hoofs because the deer come in to see what the heck you're doing. He said, when a bass gets about 7 pounds, it becomes a tom turkey. He goes, if it sees something in the woods that's not supposed to be there, it's gone. It's not curious. It doesn't care. That's something that can kill me. I'm leaving. So we start floating towards Missy and I remember thinking I could almost cast to her. Trolling motor's in the up position. And by the way, he had already told us, don't move, don't step. We're all sitting down. We start floating by her. And when we get up and the trolling motor's up, we get, I'm going to say 100 yards from her. And he turns the front depth finder on and she swam out of that bush and left.
Dang. Interesting.
And I went, okay, what just happened? And he said, she's a tom turkey now. He goes, you cannot catch that fish approaching her. He said, the only way we've caught her is we know where she rests and we know where she feeds and we get where she feeds and we wait on her. And we have a bait in the water where she feeds. And that's the 2 times we've caught her. And by the way, both times they caught her, they were only able to catch her on live bait. Wow. So my opinion on turning my electronics. So even today in a tournament, I will do my very best to have my electronics turned off. If I'm flipping shallow, they're always turned off.
Yep.
Always.
Same here, man. Same here. Hard bottom, shallow grass. They're always off.
We've had that discussion quite a bit.
Yeah.
There's no reason to have it on up in 8 foot or less of water.
Unless you're trying to sell electronics.
Yep.
A lot of guys are like, well, all the pros do it. I'm like, well, all the pros are trying to sell electronics. So yeah, they probably are,
Yeah. They've got it on demo mode. And they've got the transducer turned off.
Catch them on demo mode. Wait a minute, it's got 74 feet of water.
That's right. That's interesting about the when they reach a certain age that their habits completely change. And I can say as humans, we're similar, I mean, when you're young, you're curious about everything. You want to go over there and check, young, dumb, and full of whatever. And you want to go over there and check everything out. And then as you get kind of middle age, you're like, I'm just kind of point A to point B. And if I see something that looks kind of shady, I'm definitely going the other way. So,
well, and I think there's a little bit, y'all remember what the Darwin Awards are?
No.
The Darwin Awards are, the people who get killed incredibly stupid ways every year.
Oh, okay.
So I think there's some of that because John and I talked about this and I said, so is it that they get smarter or is it that only the really smart ones survive to 7 years old? And he said, great question. I don't know the answer to that. And I posed that same question to Todd and he said, very likely, the fish that don't get caught much are the ones that get to be 10 and 12 and 14 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
So there may be some natural selection there.
Yeah, I'd say it's a common. I mean, just right off the top of my head, it's probably a little bit of both. Maybe. I mean, I'm sure there are some that are just naturally spooky and cautious, and then there's some that have been educated by being caught or having boats float over the top of them enough times that they're just smarter. But that's a good question.